Your Creative Push, episode 292.
If you love doing something creatively, make it your practice. Make sure you take yourself seriously as an artist or a musician or a writer or whatever it is that you love to do, and do it on the regular.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Carson Ellis. Carson is the author and illustrator of the best-selling picture books Home and Do Is Talk, which was a Caldecott Honor book and the recipient of the E.B. White Read Aloud Award. She's illustrated a number of books for kids, including bestsellers The Mysterious Benedict Society by Trenton Lee Stewart, The Composer is Dead by Lemony Snicket, and The Wildwood Chronicles by Colin Meloy, who actually happens to be her husband. And she comes on the show today to talk about her art journey and some of the resistances that she has experienced along the way. She talks about going to school for painting, even though she had a lifelong desire to become an illustrator, and working in bars while doing her art on the side, and why she finally decided to leave that industry. Carson talks about her stance on working for free or working for exposure. And she also talks about working with her husband, Colin Meloy, who happens to be the frontman for the Decemberists. She talks about what it's like to live on a farm and be surrounded by animals all the time, and the importance of having your creative space in that scenario. Carson also talks about some of her resistances, about battling procrastination, and how to know when to take a break from a creative project that's giving you problems, and also how to know when to come back. And finally, Carson talks about finally getting to her childhood dream in a very roundabout way, but still getting there nonetheless. And then the theme that has been coming up the past few weeks, how artists should always be pushing themselves and taking on projects that make them feel uncomfortable. I had such a fun time talking with Carson. She is so down to earth. She's been doing her thing for a long time, and she definitely comes to this conversation with a very objective and honest look at her creative journey and how she got to the point that she is today. So I know it is going to inspire you and motivate you to get to your own work and to your own creative journey. So please enjoy. Carson, welcome to Your Creative Push.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. I'm really looking forward to kind of diving into your art history and kind of how you got to the point you are today. And I was wondering if we could actually start with, because you went to school for fine art, is that right?
It is, yeah.
Now, can you talk about that a little bit and the journey that you took from school until now as being a prolific, wonderful children's book author or illustrator and author now?
And author. Thanks. That's nice of you to say. Well, I went to the University of Montana, which is in Missoula, and I grew up in suburban New York. So sort of like a idiosyncratic choice to make, especially because I wanted to be an illustrator and they didn't have an illustration program there. But illustration was sort of my aim from the time I was a kid. Certainly when I was in high school, I was thinking a lot about children's book and children's book illustration, and I had a sense that that's what I wanted to do. But I was such a bad student in high school, and I was so unambitious that I didn't even really have the foresight to, use college as a gateway to an illustration career. So I went to a college without an illustration program, thinking that I would study art and that I would just kind of sort it out after I graduated, and that getting a painting degree was probably similar to getting a illustration degree, which it really wasn't, but it worked out. So I went to college in Montana. I studied painting, and then I graduated. And I moved around a lot. I was in Missoula for a little, and then in the Midwest for a little, and I lived at my parents' house in Vermont for a bit. And then I went to San Francisco, where I stayed for a couple of years and sort of tried to make a go of it as a painter and also as an illustrator. I had more luck as a painter. I worked in bars. I was a cocktail waitress always. And I made these big paintings and would have art shows and sort of supplement my income that way. And then in terms of illustration, I just, I didn't really know very much about it because I hadn't gone to school for it. So what I knew was that I had grown up looking at the illustrations in the New Yorker, but I didn't even know that that was its own sort of genre of illustration. I didn't know that that was editorial illustration. And I knew that I loved picture books and I wanted to figure out a way to make them, but I didn't quite know how to get there. So I did put together this kind of awful portfolio when I was in my early 20s and like biked it around to various newspapers in San Francisco and said, I'm an illustrator looking for work. And unsurprisingly didn't really get very lucky. And then I moved up to Portland where my husband lived, the person who's now my husband, who was then my friend and my old friend from college, Colin Meloy, whose band, the Decemberists, was just sort of starting out then. And we had been creative collaborators in college. And so I moved up here to Portland and he wanted to continue that collaboration. So I started doing a lot of art for his band. And that was, it was like unpaid. I would get paid in pizza because he worked in a pizza place or beer.
Hey, pizza's gold.
Pizza's gold when you're broke.
Yeah.
It's just as much of it as you could possibly eat. So I didn't really get any money for it and they didn't really have an audience then. But as they grew in popularity and as they gained an audience, I kind of gained an audience too because I was doing their album art, their t-shirt art, flyers for shows. And so people slowly started contacting me to do editorial work and then eventually ad work, which I didn't do very much of, but enough of to sort of get me out of my service industry K-hole. I was like finally quit my bartending job. I was a bartender by that point. Mm-hmm. And then a literary agent contacted me about working on picture books, which had been my goal since I was a kid. And I just had taken this very ridiculous, inefficient, roundabout way to get there. But when he did, he was like, did you ever think about this? And I was like, I've always thought about that. That's what I've always wanted to do. And he said, great, well, let's get you working on some books. And so I've kind of been doing that ever since.
Very cool. And there's a few questions I wanted to ask you about that whole kind of journey, because I think a lot of people, well, let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. When you're a cocktail waitress and then bartending and using that as a way to kind of supplement your art career and trying to push your own artwork and yourself as an artist, what was that experience like? And did you feel like it was supplementing you, or did you ever feel like you fell into kind of like a lull where it's like, all right, this is like good enough, I'm able to like put food on the table and I'm kind of sort of trying to push this art thing? Or were you like going full force at the art thing?
I don't think I was going full force at the art thing. I had a sort of epiphany at some point where I realized that I needed to quit my job working in this bar, that it was depressing, that I'd done it for a long time. Initially, because I liked bars and I liked hanging out with them in them, and I liked hanging out with people who worked in them, it seemed like this ideal kind of gig that I could just do forever. We felt very self-governed. I only had to work maybe 3 nights a week to make my rent. It seemed fine. I was like, I'll just do this forever and I'll be an artist, and these things complement each other. But at a certain point, it got depressing. And also at a certain point, I realized how kind of cowardly I was being about my art career, that I wasn't really putting myself out there for fear of failure. I was sort of like going to plug away at this bar job forever and wait for things to come my way, which they did. Things would come my way, but they would be these little trickles of things. And then I wouldn't build on that in any way. I would sort of wait for more things to come my way. So at some point I realized I had to quit my job at the bar, and I realized I had to do something more proactive if I really cared about being an artist, which I did. So I did quit my job at the bar. This was a long time ago. So it was sort of, there was obviously the internet then, but this was like maybe 15 years ago or something. And so I borrowed some money from my parents and I put a portfolio online on a website called the iSpot that our art directors and stuff looked at and hired artists from. And so that was my big step towards actually taking myself seriously as an artist and getting work. And it actually worked. It was sort of amazing. I started getting editorial jobs that paid normal editorial money, instead of working for the weeklies in my town, which paid not a living wage for that kind of work.
Just above pizza.
Just above pizza, like one step above pizza. But the first job I got, I think, was the Harvard Business Review, which was a funny job to get. But I was like, wow, this is real money. This is like, this is like what I make at the bar. I think I can do this. And so I did at some point have to take a step in that direction. But for a long time, I was just kind of like waiting for something to happen. And just worried about failing, worrying about putting my art out there in the world and not having people respond to it the way I would hope, and how I guess I thought that would feel worse. It would feel worse to fail than it would feel to just be a bartender forever. And at some point I changed my mind.
Right. Yeah, I think everybody hits that point. And I think it's very easy to fall into that kind of lull. Like you care from a young age about this thing that you want to do, and then you find a way to kind of like live on the border of it, Yeah. I'm certainly that way right now as a poker dealer. Like I've reached a point like about a year ago where I'm just completely fed up with it. And it's like the most depressing atmosphere to be in. I imagine a lot like bars, except for the customers are losing money and they're all just angry. It's a very like bad place to be, and I feel so icky when I come home. But I think like anybody that kind of gets into this situation where they do find a way to make money and kind of live on the edge of what they want to really do, no matter what the job is, it's eventually going to like feel depressing because it's not completely fulfilling, and you know that you're not really pushing it as far as you can, and maybe pushing past those resistances, those fears,
Yeah, well put.
Oh, well, thank you. And I also wanted to talk about the idea of working for pizza, and maybe not necessarily pizza, but like doing like free work, especially like early in your career, and maybe like any lessons that you might have learned about like kind of that fine line of, wanting to get paid and needing to get paid in order to like do it for a living and to be able to feed yourself, but also needing to also kind of get free exposure or whatever else is kind of promised to you.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's kind of that can be a controversial issue among artists for sure. The idea of working for free, certainly the idea of working for exposure is always controversial. I'm really glad I did a bunch of stuff for free when I did. I would say, doing all that art for the Decemberists and making flyers for bands in Portland in exchange for like drink tickets at bars or free food was a lot of what kind of put my art out in the world and made people know that I existed. I've always felt pretty strongly that, for me anyway, this doesn't work for everyone. People have different standards. But for me, it's always been really important to live like well below my means, right? And so to keep my overhead low, and also to keep my standard of living pretty low. So back when I was working for pizza, I was also living in a warehouse. My rent was very cheap. I didn't have a bathroom in my space. I had like a horrible shared bathroom in a warehouse, and I was actually very happy like that. I have very low standards.
Nice.
Sort of thing. So that worked in my favor. It helps to be an artist with low standards. But so I was able to do that, right? It's sort of a luxury to work for free. I was able to pay my rent with 3 days of working at the bar. And then I was just really excited that anybody wanted me to do anything, to be in any art shows or to make any flyers or to make art for a t-shirt. That was always thrilling for me. And I feel like back then Portland was a pretty small art community, and there was just a lot of that sort of bartering happening, and it felt great and good to me. So it was important to me to do all that stuff for free because it made me work. It gave me stuff to do. It made me feel like I was part of a creative scene, and I got whatever weird stuff in exchange. But I also went to the University of Montana, and I graduated with not much in the way of outstanding student loans. And I moved into a warehouse where my rent was $300 a month. So I don't know if that's the same tale or advice I could give to someone who graduated from an expensive art school with a lot of student loans to pay off and is now living in a city where they really have to hustle to make all that work. It doesn't work for everyone. But I think if you can work for free in the beginning, it's probably a good idea, to just work, to just have deadlines and to have people that are depending on you to make art. And it helps get your work out there, but it develops a work ethic, and it helps you take yourself seriously as an artist.
Absolutely. And you can get a husband out of it too.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah, if you're lucky.
And I wanted to talk about that, your relationship with Colin too. Like, I think it's really cool to have a partner, like somebody that you can like live with and relate to, and like that you're both doing your own kind of creative things. I wonder, have you like kind of developed a creative thesis, or like what does your creative life look like together?
Well, we are sometimes working on projects together. when we're collaborating on something. We just finished art for an album that came out, so that was very collaborative. And we had a book that came out in last October that we worked on together. So when we're working on something together, there's kind of a lot of communication about it. And it does sort of take over the kind of collective consciousness of our house. You know, we have a couple kids too, so we're always sort of talking about these projects. And then a lot of the time we're working on separate projects. Like right now, we're each working on picture books, but neither of them are collaborations with each other. So I don't know. It sort of depends. We've been collaborating and hanging out with each other for so many years, you know, like 20 years. So it kind of feels like at this point we're like, I guess it's true of all married people, but like two halves of a whole, you know,
right,
like I just feel like we share a brain. I feel very telepathic with him when it comes to collaborative stuff. I feel like we don't have to talk through things as much as we used to, because I just have a sense of what he is hoping for, and he has a sense of what I would like to do creatively. I don't know. It's good. It's nice.
That's good.
We're both introverts and we're both kind of loners. So we spend weeks and weeks when he's home from tour anyway, you know, being alone on our property together and sort of only hanging out with each other or ourselves. It's a quiet life out here. We live on a little farm, but it's really sweet. I love it.
Yeah, a quiet life with a ton of animals. I think I read my favorite. I read this to my wife on your bio. Carson lives in a farm in Oregon with Colin, their two sons, one cat, two llamas, two goats, one sheep, 10 chickens, a family of barn owls, and an unfathomable multitude of tree frogs.
Yeah,
which
all
especially
true.
to my wife sounds like a dream. Like that's like her goal is to get like somewhere where we can be surrounded by animals, and mine too. What is that like, and what do the animals do they see their way into your art or to your life?
I don't know. I think it's nice to have them around. I am a lover of animals. They are all, even though that sounds like a lot of animals, they're all low maintenance sort of animals. So, you know, in the summer right now, all those big farm animals are grazing. They don't need anything from me. Like the llamas will have to get sheared by a farrier soon. And we have to refill their water once in a while, but they kind of keep to themselves. So they're like these nice, peaceful, giant farm animals that we visit with and spend time with, but that don't depend on us for much. And I do really love living on a property where there can be so many animals. Most of them have been adopted from people who didn't want them anymore. So we live outside of Portland. Most of our friends live in Portland. So I think when someone has an animal and they don't want it anymore, they're like, call Carson. She is a sucker and they have plenty of room. And so that's how we keep ending up with a lot of them.
That's awesome.
People's chickens. That's how we got our goats. That's how we got our sheep. And I love it. The farm is more of a quandary for me because I love living here and it's very peaceful and it's a good place to work and it's a good place to be and it's an awesome place to raise kids. But I don't know that farming has never been an aspiration of mine. And I didn't grow up as one of those kids that had this dream of one day living on a farm. I had a dream of one day living like in the mountains. You know, I've always wanted to live in a wild place where there's not so much to take care of. There's a lot to take care of here. It's a lot of things to be responsible for.
So somewhere with less dependency.
Less dependency, probably less outbuildings. You know, like there's a bunch of kind of decrepit, amazing, but old decrepit outbuildings here. But I love it. I do. And I'm a huge gardener and I have big gardens and I spend a lot of time gardening and some time with the animals. And it's good.
That's very cool. And now when you were describing like kind of your and Colin's life, I imagine you just kind of sitting there together, but just like constantly working. And I wonder how much output do you guys have? And then like how much input as well?
Well, we are mostly working, I guess. Colin is so different because his work is like when he's writing a book, he's working. He goes into his studio. He spends a chunk of time sitting in front of his computer writing every day. But obviously writing an album is really different. You know, you're sort of write when you're inspired to write, but you can't just sit down in a studio and write music all day. Some people actually do. I think most people don't. It's more like you sit down in a studio and you strum a guitar for a little, and then if that doesn't work for you, you go for a walk or something. But yeah, we're mostly working. We are rarely working in the same place. It's sort of sweet when we do. It always feels like a special occasion when we have some reason to be in each other's studios, like working on something. Mostly we're in separate buildings. I'm in like a little house in a field on the other side of our driveway, and he is in a room in our garage that's been converted into a studio for him. So, yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, but how important is that too, to kind of have separate spaces, like, and not only like separate from maybe each other or the world, but just kind of like your own place to create?
I think it feels important to me to have my own place. I've had a wild variety of studios, ranging from just like the closet of a bedroom to this magical, ridiculous studio that I have now. But having my own space has always been important. And that not only having my own physical space, but having my own space from other humans to do work kind of in solitude is important to me, and has been always, I think probably since I was a kid. Colin and I have to have separate spaces because he can't write songs with other people in the room. So, I mean, he doesn't even like to have a studio where people can hear him anywhere. So we all sort of, he sits in his room and in his studio and writes songs, and we pretend we can't hear. He's like, could the nanny hear me? I'm like, no, she couldn't hear you.
That's awesome.
He's a super loud singer, though. I'm sure like the neighbors half a mile away can hear him. But yeah, so that's why we need our own spaces for practical reasons, but also I think for just work habit reasons.
Yeah, I'm actually the same way. I'm quite introverted, and actually most podcasters are, but it's always funny. Like, I'm talking to somebody, I'm having a conversation, and I know that, a couple thousand people are going to hear it, yet like I want my wife to be far enough away that she, like, I know that nobody can hear me talking. It's like so weird.
It's funny.
But I think that it's also really important, and I try to promote this on the podcast, is having that kind of sacred space where you can go to create, because it puts you in like a mentality to like do work, like to get to your work and to not be distracted by other things. And it's like, all right, I'm in this new location now. It's time to actually get to my thing rather than kind of pushing it off or finding other distractions. Like this is go time,
Yeah, I mean, kind of. I do so much procrastinating in my studio, but at least I'm here. I mean, I think sometimes you have to procrastinate. You'd be like, artists aren't robots. You can't just come in and punch in and start working and finish when you're done. I do that a lot more now that I have kids than I ever would have thought possible before I had kids. Before I had kids, I thought that, you only worked when the inspiration hit you. But now 15 years or whatever, 20 years into an illustration career and 12 years into parenthood, I know that some of that is hooey. Mm-hmm. And the myth of the artist who only works when they're inspired is, I don't know. It's not real for me anyway, but I do a lot of procrastinating, and I do a lot of working in here.
Right. Well, I think that like there is some forms of good procrastination, because I think especially in kind of today's technological world, it's like artists are never like, we never have like downtime. We never have like times where our brain is like not going, except for like right before we fall asleep or like when we're in the shower. Not like procrastination is okay, but like as long as you're not procrastinating because you're scared of it or because you just don't feel like doing it, I think it's good to have that kind of alone time with your own brain.
Yeah, for sure. You need to let your brain rest. You need input too. You can't just always be making things. You have to be putting things into your brain that can become like fodder for art,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do procrastinate a lot because I'm scared of things too, but that's the way that goes.
And then what's your way to kind of battle through that?
I don't know. I guess I try to step away from it. Like I said, I'm a huge gardener, so it helps. And I live on this farm property where there's always something to do. So it helps to have something that always needs me outside of my studio. If I need to walk out the door and just do something else, to step away from it. Sometimes I have a book I'm working on now, and I had a really, really hard time figuring out how to illustrate it. And so I really just took a month of not thinking about it. I don't even think that's procrastination. I just, I thought too much about it, and I got into this sort of spiral of not knowing how to solve certain problems in the book. And so I just didn't think about it for a month, and then I came back and had a better sense of how to do it.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice too, is to get distance from something that you can't quite figure out. How do you know when it's time to come back then?
In the case of I mean, a lot of the time the deadline dictates it.
The
I'm
deadline,
like, oh
yeah.
my God, I have to get to work on this or I'm going to be so screwed. But yeah, I think the deadline has something to do with it. And in the case of this, I just stewed over it for a long time, right? That's the wrong word. I let it stew for a long time. I would think about it a little bit, kind of like peripherally, until it solved itself in my head. And then I was like, I think I know the solution. And then I came back in and started working on it.
Nice. Are you allowed to say what that book is?
Yeah, I can. It's this picture book by Susan Cooper called The Shortest Day, and it's about the winter solstice.
Oh, cool.
So it's a poem. Yeah. Yeah, it's a poem. So it's really, a lot is left up to interpretation. It's very evocative and sort of vague and beautiful. And so it's the sort of thing where you could go a million different directions with it. And I had gone a direction that the author didn't like. And she sent me a letter with a lot of suggestions and advice. And it was all good. It was a really good letter, but it was really overwhelming. Like I was like, I don't know what to do with this. The book that she wants me to make is more profound than I am capable of, was sort of how I felt. But then I just kind of kept thinking about it. And after a month, I was like, no, I think I can do what she's asking.
Well, I wanted to talk about that idea of kind of making decisions too. And I could talk about like all your books, but specifically Do Is Talk. Because in there you essentially make a new language, like you created a new language. So I was wondering if you could talk about that and then kind of the decision process behind specifically that concept of creating a new language.
Yeah. So that book is about bugs, or I mean, I guess it's about a plant that's growing and the world that's revolving around it, this microcosmic world of bugs and small creatures. And the book watches the plant get bigger and bigger and then die. And then, scatter seeds. And then at the end, more plants grow. So it's sort of about the growth cycle of plants, which as a gardener, I'm super into. And the decision I knew what I wanted the book to look like. And I knew that that was the basic kind of conceit of it. It sort of works as an animation, right? Because there's the same basic composition on every spread in the book. You have this log on the left, and then you have this plant that on each page gets a little bigger until it dies, and then it gets smaller. And I knew that there was a sort of narrative I wanted to get across with these little creatures and that things would happen in the story. So the whole idea came to me pretty quickly, but then it felt very static. And I felt like the thing that would have drawn me into it when I was a kid would be if that world felt really immersive. When I was a kid, I was always trying to immerse myself in these worlds of small creatures. I had like salamanders and snakes and frogs and aquariums, and I was always collecting animals and sort of imagining their interior lives. And so that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of tap into that thing about my own childhood that was so beloved and interesting. But without the language, I felt like they wouldn't be speaking English. That felt wrong, or any discernible language. But without any language, it just felt static. So I added this imaginary language. And the more I sort of puzzled it out, the more I realized that I could probably invent a language that would be translatable if anybody really cared to do it. So that became another level of the book that was really interesting to me, was that it was sort of like a puzzle. But at the same time, it was really important to me to make this book that would work on a bunch of different levels, like would work narratively if you had no idea what they were saying, and would work if you were a really little kid and you just wanted to pick out, if you were like a toddler and you just wanted to pick out various creatures, and would also work if you were a lot older and you wanted to go through and make a glossary of the words and try to translate it.
Right. Well, I think it's so cool and so well done as well. Did it ever, like, did you ever regret that decision to make a new, like, did it ever become overly complicated? Like you said, it's kind of ends up being translatable, which I'm sure you had to kind of create rules and stuff like that for yourself. So did it ever kind of become overcomplicated?
It didn't. The language was actually the easy part of that book.
Really? That's so cool.
Yeah. The hard part of it was doing the art for it, because I found it, monotonous, laborious. It has all this detail, and I would be drawing sort of the same thing on every page as though I was drawing an animation. and I'm impatient. I
Right.
want art to be gratifying. I want every picture to be something that was fun to make. And that book, that wasn't the case. But then I was very happy when it was done.
Well, it was certainly well done. And of course, that's why you were honored with the Caldecott Honor.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, well done. Well, I wanted to talk about your actual process of drawing as well. And I had read or saw somewhere that the pens that you use and how you like to kind of slow down the process and also kind of embrace or enjoy making mistakes. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, well, I guess, I don't really know how to use computers well to make art. That was definitely after my time at the University of Montana. So I graduated from there in like 1997, and I just graduated into a world that was about to become super digital with like my University of Montana art skills, which were like how to take slides and present a proposal for an art show to a gallery, like all of these skills that I would never really need.
Right.
Both because I wouldn't be a fine artist, I would end up being an illustrator, and also because the world was about to become a digital world of online portfolios and stuff. So I never really learned to use computers. I don't know how to make art with them in a good way. So I sometimes use them if I want to make art and I want to make something that needs to be printed in a graphic way, like a t-shirt or a poster or something, then I'll use the computer to do color separation, and I make more digital art, but mostly I'm painting and drawing. There are a lot of ways I could do what I'm doing digitally, I think, and maybe even make art digitally that would look similar to what I'm doing now in an analog way. But I don't really want to, because I actually like all that time spent painting and drawing. It's super meditative. I'm not sure if that time was spent instead of sitting at my desk painting and drawing in front of a computer and there was less of it, I think I would get more work done, but I think I would feel less gratified as an artist. There's like a meditative quality to doing that painting and drawing that I don't get from working on a computer. I really need to be like hunching over my table and getting paint on me and stuff.
It's one of the most important parts of doing anything creative is like enjoying that time. And I think anytime, it feels like work, or it feels like you have to get to this thing and it feels like a job, I think that's when you're on the wrong path.
Yeah. I mean, kind of. I wish that was truly the case, because I think a lot of the time, no matter how much you love your work, and I love my work, I feel like I'm doing what I really want to do, making books and making album art and making fine art for shows sometimes. Like, these are the things that make me really happy. And it's always a grind. Like, there's always some point in every project where I'm like, why did I even decide to do this? I think that's part of the practice, is getting through the parts that aren't inspiring to you and doing the work that does feel like a grind, because art can't always be, well, that's not true. Art can always be this mystical, inspired experience. And maybe illustration can be too. I don't know. But it feels to me like when you're an illustrator, you're solving these visual problems. You're figuring out a way to elaborate and enhance a piece of text. And so there's like a mathematical, pragmatic problem-solving piece to it too. And the execution often involves something sort of boring and laborious. In every project, I feel like there's a really inspired part where I am like in a mystical art making place. And then there's a really boring part where I'm like, well, now I've got to paint blades of grass all day.
Right.
But I'll be happy when it's done.
Right. Well, and you just mentioned that, like, you love what you're doing. And it kind of seems like what you mentioned in the beginning of the episode, talking about being young and kind of envisioning doing what you're doing now. Would you say that you're kind of doing exactly what you were envisioning when you were a kid?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Isn't that crazy? I would actually say that. It's amazing. I'm incredibly lucky. But I think both in the respect that I'm writing and illustrating books for kids, which I always wanted to do, and also in the respect that I'm like Pippi Longstocking living on this farm with 8 million animals.
Right. Right.
I think both things, the 8-year-old me would be like, yes, well done.
Well, my question is, like, looking kind of back at your journey, it is kind of a roundabout way. Like, you went to school for something different, and there was ups and downs, I'm sure, along the way.
Plenty of them, yeah.
Yeah. So kind of looking back and seeing that you did end up exactly kind of where you wanted to be, do you have any lessons or anything that maybe you would want to instill to any, especially young people listening right now, as far as like getting to your goal?
I don't know. I honestly feel so lucky. I feel like I've made countless idiotic decisions in my life. I fucked around for so many years, not really taking anything seriously and hoping that things would work out the way I wanted them to. So I feel like I got really lucky. I do feel, like some practical pieces of advice I have for artists are like, keep your overhead low. Mm-hmm. Maybe consider not going to a super expensive school, maybe consider living in a city that's not super expensive, because just in practical terms, if you want to spend a lot of time making art, even if you do go to college like I did, you might graduate from college not the best artist. I graduated not the best artist. If I showed you my portfolio when I was 22 years old, you would think it was bad and you wouldn't want to hire me. It's just the truth. So it took me a bunch of years to evolve as an artist to the point of being hireable. If I had been hustling that whole time, if I had not been able to afford to have like a job 3 days a week and have all that rest of that time to work on art, I'm not sure if I would have figured out my thing. Like, I don't know if I would have figured out how to become a good artist. And you need to make the time and the space to do that. And you need to have the dedication to do it. And I think I see a lot of people in these sort of untenable situations where they have to hustle so hard and they're so broke that it's so hard to make the time and space to explore your art practice. And that's a really important component of it. And that wasn't something I did intentionally at all. I did that out of laziness. I just moved to the closest cheap city near me and got the space in a warehouse where a bunch of people I knew lived and got the first job that was handed to me. But it somehow my laziness and my lack of ambition has really served me throughout the course of my life. It's sort of sad. I was telling my kid the other day that I didn't think this was a great philosophy to impart to him as my child, because it's, I don't know if it works for everybody. It probably doesn't work for most people, but that in my life, I've had very low expectations for myself. And so whenever I have exceeded that, it's easy to exceed them if you have low expectations. And so I don't know. It's got off on a weird tangent,
no.
But I think it's, I don't know. I guess just taking it easy on yourself and making sure that you're making that space in your life to make art and to pursue art in a way that doesn't just make everything more difficult and stressful.
Right. No, I think there's something to be said about low expectations, and not necessarily like low expectations, but just not like these like grandiose, like I'm only going to be considered a successful artist or a successful creative person if I reach this pinnacle, whether it's like 1 million followers or making $1 million or winning this award or whatever, like setting those really ridiculous expectations that are usually like pinned to a very small percentage of artists that you probably inspire you for sure, but it's not realistic, and then falling short of it in any way is considered a failure. And also, like you said, keeping a low overhead. I think especially going to an expensive art school and then moving to an expensive city, like you're just setting yourself up for a really difficult start of your journey when you should be thinking about like exactly what you're saying, like working on your own art, figuring out what you care about, like figuring out what you want to say or what you want to get out of life, not necessarily like how you're going to pay rent.
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, when I said that to my kid about having low expectations, my husband jumped in and he was like, LeBron did not have low expectations. He has the highest expectations in the world. And he has to start every game by saying, we're going to crush them. And then after they lose and the interviewer comes to talk to him, he has to say, well, we didn't crush them. We lost, but next time we'll do better. So I think basically different sort of approaches to life fit for different personality types. And Colin is more in the LeBron mindset. Like he just has always shooted for the stars the whole time that I've known him. So I think there are different ways to do it. And that my maybe low expectations have always been a way of sort of protecting my own feelings from getting hurt. Different things work for different people. But it is true that if your expectations for yourself as an artist are low, then you will always be thrilled with every small accomplishment. And every time you move ahead and get a little closer to the thing you want to do, it will be thrilling rather than lackluster, you know?
Well, I wonder now after, you have done many wonderful things and, you've been doing this for a long time. Do you still get caught up in any resistances or any things? Like, does the laziness still come, or do like the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, does that come in?
Yeah, of course. All that stuff comes in all the time. Laziness, I could stand to be more lazy. I used to be very lazy, but now with all these things that I'm juggling, also with a husband this year that's on tour a lot. So I've got these 2 kids and this farm and some deadlines, and I'm a single mom a lot of the year when he's on the road. So I'm not lazy anymore. I need to be more lazy. I need to figure out how to have less responsibility so I can chill out more, which is a thing that I would never have believed would be true of myself if you'd asked me, 20 years ago. When I considered myself a person with very little work ethic. Now I think my work ethic's awesome. But in terms of being afraid or having doubts about projects, that always, yes. And I would assume that'll always happen. I don't know how I actually think if you are only doing projects that you have no doubts about or no fears about, you're probably not quite on the right path. I think you got to get off the well-worn path of what you know how to do well to do things that are challenging in order to kind of stay on your toes as an artist and to be evolving always.
Don't get too comfortable.
Don't get too comfortable. It's not a good place for an artist to be. It should never be too comfortable.
Absolutely. Well, Carson, this has been awesome, and I know I want to value your time. So we will get to the final push, and this is where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today, and just give them your best final words of advice and really push them to pursue their own creative passions.
I feel like I've given so much bad advice today, like, no. Keep your expectations really low, be lazy.
Get more lazy.
I think that my best advice to people is always like, if you love doing something creatively, make it your practice. Make sure you take yourself seriously as an artist or a musician or a writer or whatever it is that you love to do, and do it on the regular. Like, don't have it be a thing that you make when you have time for, or you think about doing a lot, but you don't do. Have it be part of your daily life. You just can't ever lose by trying and by making more art. And you only get better the more you do it. You only discover more things and evolve more.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and it makes all the other aspects of your life that much better too, because you come to the rest of your life in a much more like kind of satisfied way, like that you are expressing yourself and you are trying to figure out the world.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Love it. Carson, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for sharing your story and for helping us out.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. And you can find Carson on her website, which is carsonellis.com. And on Instagram, she is Carson Ellis. And we'll have that all linked up at today's show notes page at yourcreativepush.com/Carson Ellis. Carson, thanks again.
Thank you.
Yay! Carson Ellis, everybody. Thank you again to Carson for coming on the show, for making the time out of her busy schedule to come on and hopefully inspire y'all. 2 things that I wanted to recount from this episode out of the many great things that she said. The first one's going to be quick. The second one's a little bit longer. But first of all, make your art, make your creativity a practice, and do it on the regular, like Carson said, instead of doing it when you can find the time. We mention this topic all the time on the podcast, but it's so important to get back to because it's so easy to, especially if your art is not part of your regular income, part of the thing that you do for a living, it's very easy for it to fall to the wayside for other family things and job things and life things to come in and take precedent over your calendar, over your schedule. But it's so important to make your art your schedule and make the other things fit around it instead of the opposite. If you want this thing to be a part of your life, you have to pencil it in. You have to make appointments with it. You have to take initiative for it to be a major part of your life instead of something that you like Carson said, just get to whenever you can find the time or whenever you can find the motivation or whenever you're not feeling scared. Make it a practice, make it a regular thing, and it will become more of an integral part of your life. And then secondly, the more that I thought about that dichotomy that Carson was talking about of art being, kind of magical half the time and then feeling like work the other half of the time, the more I realized how incredibly true that is. In almost everything that I've done and so many of the guests that I've talked to, that's where a lot of the resistance comes in. When it starts feeling like work, when it starts feeling a little bit boring, and when you have a lot of kind of busy work to do, like fill in blades of grass, kind of that mindless busy work that comes with finishing a project. And I think a lot of the resistances that happen with us, the things that try to hold us back, can happen during that busy work because we're spending so much time doing this mindless stuff and the project's not quite finished, that we have all of this time to think about doubts, all of the reasons that maybe this project shouldn't exist, that this project shouldn't be in the world, the reasons why we should just stop doing this project or put it off or do something else. But it's really important to get back in that mindset of, okay, this is just the comfortable stuff. This is just the easy stuff. Even though it's boring, even though it doesn't quite give us that same type of drive, that same type of emotional surge, or make our hearts flutter or give us those nervous farts like it does when we're in that magical phase of the project, it doesn't mean that the project isn't worth finishing, and it doesn't mean that we're doing something wrong. And my advice is to try to find the calm in that busy work, in that boring work, to try to find a meditative state when you're doing that work instead of a panic state or instead of a bored state. But at the same time, also be aware of your feelings as you're getting to your art. Because if it does start to feel like that boring stuff is coming up more often and a bit too much, it might be off balance. And you might not be challenging yourself, or you might need to step away or find a way to shake things up to bring that excitement back into it. So don't get too hard on yourself if you do have long periods of more boring efforts towards your art. As long as you are doing your art and getting to it, that is the important thing. We all have boring things that come with our creative process. We all have unexciting things that we do in between those extremely exciting and magical moments in our art. But just realize that it's that work, that boring work that you don't necessarily want to get to, that makes you a professional, that pushes you past all of the other people that aren't getting to their work because they're too lazy to even think about doing that kind of work. And also try to find the meditation in it, to enjoy that experience as much as you can, because it does represent the fact that you are getting to your work and you are pushing past all your resistances to get to your creative passion. As long as it doesn't represent complacency, and as long as you are continuing to push yourself and not only doing boring work that you're used to, you are on the right path. So just keep pushing, keep doing it, and try to make it as enjoyable as possible. Again, if you want to get links to everything we talked about today, or you want to find everywhere that Carson is or buy her books, definitely head to the show notes page today at yourcreativepush.com/292. But that is all I've got for you today, so hopefully you were inspired to go and get your work done. So go and get it done, and we will be here for you next week if you need that push again. I love you all so much, but I love you even more if you get your work done. So go keep creating it. Bye, guys. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.